It's not an unpopular opinion that Kokomi is the poster child of a badly written character in Genshin. Not only did she have one of the most controversial releases in the game because, she can't crit, she also had a rough time in the Archon quest, story quest, and events. And I'm sorry to tell you that after 2 years, it honestly hasn't gotten much better. Fontaine literally just came out, and Kokomi is still the mess that she was when she first came out. At least in terms of her writing. I think her kit had its own redemption arc with the release of Dendro. So where did it all go wrong? If you've blocked most of her story from your brain and enjoy her purely because you love her design and her playstyle like I do, then you're probably pissed or annoyed at how badly Hoyo missed the mark when it comes to Kokomi's story. But was her writing always as terrible as most of the community make it out to be? So let's start there. Let's start with how Hoyo introduces Kokomi to the players. What if I told you that Kokomi actually had a pretty good introduction to the story? I mean, it's been 2 years, and with all of the criticism towards her about her role in the Archon quest, which we will get into later on, Kokomi actually had a good introduction, in my opinion. I think a lot of people just forgot that the first 2 acts of the Inazuma Archon quest was actually not that bad. To fully explain what truly went wrong with Kokomi, we need to revisit the Inazuma Archon quest that came out in 2.0 and 2.1 respectively. So, okay, we get to Inazuma and the stakes are much higher than the previous 2 Archon quests. We meet Toma and Ayaka and we learn about the Vision Hunt Decree and how it's affecting vision holders, and while the traveler was reluctant at first, they inevitably agree to help after learning the devastating effects of having one's vision taken away. This is also the first time since launch that the game explains the nature of visions and how they're tied to ambition, and how people losing their visions will ultimately lose their ambition and will to live. They completely become a different person, a shallow husk of their former selves, if you will. And then we, as the traveler, got to see all of that in great detail. And adding to all of that, we soon learned that the first person who befriended us in Inazuma, Toma, was going to be next. He was going to be the 100th vision holder to have their vision taken away from them. And because it's the big 100th vision, the Shogun and the Tenryo Commission holds this ceremony in front of the statue of the omnipresent god. We jump in to save Toma, got our ass kicked by the Raiden Shogun, and then Toma saved us in one of the most underrated moments I've seen in the game. After escaping and reaching the Komori tea house, he suggests the traveler to head to Tatarasuna and later Yashiori Island to meet with the Resistance. The Resistance, founded by none other than Sangonomiya Kokomi herself. The Resistance is also the only group in Inazuma brave enough to go against the Shogun, and therefore the only ones who will accept the traveler now that we're on the Shogun's hit list. And on the way there, we learn through eavesdropping that the Resistance is vastly outnumbered, which makes sense. But somehow, they're able to hold their own and win battle after battle thanks to their brilliant strategist, Kokomi. And soon after that, we meet Teppei, and eventually Teppei introduces us to Goro. Up until this point, I personally think the quest was fine. We were getting to know the Resistance, and while I wish we got to spend more time with Goro instead of Teppei, I still think it's okay. Like, I get what Hoyo was trying to do here. After going around the camp with Teppei, we learned that Goro went to the front lines because Sara herself was there. And then Sara herself says that despite being severely outnumbered, the only reason the Resistance was able to make it this far was thanks to Kokomi. And this is where the problem starts. The game literally built so much hype around Kokomi and her genius that you can't help but feel excited to actually meet her in the quest and to see her in action. And she does indeed appear in one of the most hype moments of the Inazuma Archon quest, at least in my opinion. And that moment was when Kokomi stepping in to save the Resistance with backup. 2 vision holders at that, forcing Sara and the Shogunate army to retreat. And with that, we end the first 2 acts of the Inazuma Archon quest. I mean, there's a lot more to it, but this is just a brief recap of what happened. And I genuinely enjoyed the first 2 acts. I can still recall the dread that I felt back then when I had to wait a few weeks for the 2.1 update. I want wanted to know what the resistance had in store for the story. I wanted to know more about Kokomi and Goro and see more of them in action. I was also excited that Kazuha was back in Inazuma. Up until this point, the game also did a fairly decent job in establishing the political landscape of Inazuma. And by that, I mean we learned through several characters that the people of Watatsumi Island used to worship the Electro Archon until she killed Orobashi, who, if you don't know, was basically the savior and creator of Watatsumi Island. Watatsumi Island itself would not have existed if not for Orobashi. Like, it's literally made from his corals. So you can understand why the people of Watatsumi would be upset at the shogun for killing him and then leaving his remains on Yashiori Island. And this created a lot of theories about why Kokomi formed the rebellion in the first place, but we'll get back to this later because oh boy, the theories. So back to the Archon quest and Kokomi, and yeah, unfortunately this is where the good part of her writing ends, and it's all kind of downhill from here. Because unfortunately for Kokomi, she falls victim to the atrocious pacing of the Inazuma Archon quest, which was mostly because Hoyo forced to wrap everything up in like 3 acts, the same way they did in Mondstadt and Liyue. And obviously this didn't work, considering how much more dense and high stakes the Inazuma storyline was compared to the previous 2 regions. Granted, a lot of the other characters suffered due to the story being rushed, like Goro, and even A herself is a victim of this, but Kokomi was just, oh, you did her so dirty after building her up so much in the first 2 acts. So back to the quest. After the whole thing with Sara, we go back to Watatsumi Island with Kokomi. We get there and Kokomi immediately informed us about the supply shortage that they're facing. Understandable, because war is terrible and rough and Watatsumi isn't exactly known for its fertile soil. She voices concern about how they quite literally couldn't afford any more losses, hence why she accepted help from a mystery sponsor. And for someone who supposedly thinks of every scenario and has plans for everything, it baffles me how Kokomi went through with this. She only says that they had a common goal and that was apparently enough for her. Yes, I understand that she was in a desperate situation and this wouldn't be a problem if the game wasn't trying to sell her as this genius war strategist every time she's on screen. And she even says herself that it's suspicious, so it doesn't make any sense that she has no backup plan just in case this mystery supporter sponsor turns out for the worst, which it did. I mean, again, I can understand her not having any other options and this was the best that she can do, but the whole point of her character is that she's supposed to be this genius who is always prepared. And I'm not exactly going to blame her for not having a backup plan just in case her soldiers start rapidly aging after using delusions of all things, but because really, how can anyone even think of that scenario? But you'd think she would have something. And I'm not saying that Kokomi should be flawless and isn't allowed to make mistakes, quite the opposite actually. What I think makes a great character is how believable they are as real humans in this made-believe world, and Kokomi being a genius doesn't mean she's not allowed to face hardships. It's also the reason why I do these videos. Even if Genshin is ultimately a gacha game full of tropes, it's full of well-designed characters with interesting lore to them, which is what drives me insane when they're not being utilized or explored in the game's actual story. So back to Kokomi. She's of course allowed to be wrong. It's just that Hoyo kind of forgot to show her being an actual genius in the Archon quest. And not only that, Hoyo also sort of forgot to show why she's going against the Shogun in the first place. I don't know if this piece of information is hidden somewhere because I've tried looking. Maybe I missed it, so please let me know in the comments if I did.
Yeah, so my bad. I actually missed it because they actually explained this in her Vision character details or story, and it's actually a really good read. It talks about how Kokomi doesn't really have any strong ideals of her own, but she does respect the will of her people, and it does show her willingness to help others and her desire to protect people, which is why she chose to lead the resistance during the Vision Hunt decree.
But what was her plan really? The game tells you that she's smart and that the resistance is holding their own against Sara's army and the shogunate. But what is she planning to do with the shogun? Because if they're barely surviving going against the Tenryo Commission and Kujo Sara, how were they going to go against the shogun herself? The Raiden Shogun is supposed to be invincible in the story, not even the Traveler, who at this point in the story is infamous for not only saving Mondstadt but also being the big reason why Liyue didn't drown, is expected to go 1v1 her in combat. Like, Ayaka doesn't tell the Traveler to go fight the Shogun in order to repeal the Vision Hunt decree, because the idea of defeating the Shogun in combat is that ludicrous. And the Traveler is supposed to be overpowered. That's why so many people hype them up for saving Mondstadt and Liyue. Even in the final confrontation, the Traveler had to have this massive power boost from the collective ambition of the people of Inazuma to overpower A. Yet here we have Kokomi, the supposed genius strategist, leading the charge against the Vision Hunt decree, going against a literal god in order to do what exactly? What exactly was her plan if she does, by some miracle, manage to defeat Sara and the Tenryo Commission and make her way to Tenchukaku? Kokomi is obviously someone who leans into diplomatic relations rather than brute force, so you could speculate that she was going to negotiate a deal with the Shogun and reason with her, which, even as I'm writing the script for this, the idea of Kokomi trying to negotiate with the Shogun just sounds so ridiculous. Even more so because if she does somehow succeed, she'll soon discover that the Shogun is in fact a puppet. And I don't know how do you even reason with a puppet. Even A herself had to fight this puppet for hundreds of years in order to change its mind in her second story quest. Granted, we can't blame Kokomi for not predicting that Inazuma's god is actually a puppet, but again, even when grasping at straws, the narrative of Kokomi being a genius or a master strategist just falls apart in the Archon quest. Because why would this master strategist and genius sacrifice her own people for a war that she should know she can't win? And on top of that, the writers clearly didn't know what to do with her, because after making a mistake with the mystery sponsor, aka the Fatui, they just kind of forgot about her. Like, legit, we don't see her again until the end of the Archon quest. She doesn't even appear with Goro and Kazuha in Tenchukaku. Where was she? And we know later on that this wasn't even Kokomi that sent the resistance there. It was Ayato. So was she dealing with the aftermath of the delusions? I mean it when I say that Kokomi suffered the worst from Inazuma's poor pacing. Because Hoyo is shown to be able to write solid, intelligent characters like Nahida and Alhaitham, and even just writing side characters that actually add something to the plot and story like Diya and Candace. And unfortunately for Kokomi, this doesn't just end with the Inazuma Archon quest. Her story quest was such a waste in my opinion. Hoyo had every chance to dive into the more interesting part of her lore and how her bloodline is tied to Watatsumi and Orobashi, but nope, it's a quest about how overwhelmed Kokomi gets and how she's tired from overworking herself and how she's also very introverted and very much is crushing on the Traveler. Or at least it's implied that she has a crush on the Traveler. Which again, this is just a problem with Genshin's story quests in general, not just Kokomi. I think Albedo suffers from this exact problem too, but at least he got something from events even though they're time-gated. Kokomi's story quest actually has an interesting premise. Like, it deals with how a lot of her soldiers are struggling with the end of the war. I like that it touches on darker themes of even if the war has technically ended, there's just too much damage and that has just been done to the people of Inazuma. And in the same story quest, they also showed how a lot of people in Watatsumi Island just actively distrust the Tenryo Commission and by extension, the Raiden Shogun. I think one of the elder NPCs actually says this, which is super interesting to me given their history and how with A murdered Orobashi, and it could have been such an interesting thing to dive into, like Kokomi struggling with not only her own personal burnout but also keeping the peace that was so hard earned. But then the quest took a turn, focusing on how she needed to take naps and asking the Traveler to read her books, and later on negotiations with Kujo Sara, which was supposed to be this big brain moment for her, but it really wasn't. It was just her getting lucky that the rumors one of her soldiers started turned out to be true, and Sara took another L for the sake of the story. Now, I'm not saying that characters like Kokomi aren't allowed to show that they're burnt out. It's just that we already got that storyline with Jean. Why not use this personal story quest to explore something unique to Kokomi? What the story quest also highlights is that she is more of a strategy nerd than she is a genius, really. And I think it would have been better if Hoyo just sold her as this introverted nerd who was forced into this position as the divine priestess because of her bloodline and the leader of the island, but now she struggles in balancing all of those things. And especially because she's so young, a lot of people underestimate her. And all of this is, I think, what they were kind of going for too, especially when you take a look at her character story. Because it's all there. I think if they didn't focus on the genius part of her trope so much, she would have been a much more well-rounded character and she would have felt more relatable to a lot of players. And I think that's my biggest gripe when it comes to Kokomi's story and writing. She has such an interesting premise, but Hoyo just does nothing with it. I personally think that a story about how this character, who is an underdog, earning the trust of her people by using her unique advantage as an introverted nerd, is at least a bit more interesting than what we got. But unfortunately, all of that is just kinda erased or at least put in the back seat, so the game could tell you how smart she is and how she thinks of everything for the 5th time. And her story quest focuses on the least interesting part of her character, which is Kokomi is an introvert. Again, I'm not saying that she shouldn't have relatable qualities like being an introvert who's forced to do a really hard job of taking care of an entire island. But it's just not the most interesting part of her character, and highlighting that just leaves an impression that she's overworked waifu number 4. Which is a shame because she's a lot more than that. They just don't show it. Now this problem isn't unique to Kokomi at all, but I would say she suffers from it the most still. Hoyo, or at least in Genshin, has a tendency to only tell but not actually showing anything when it comes to their writing and characters. One of the reasons why Kokomi is more of a meme than an actual character at certain points is because of how Hoyo is so insistent that she's this genius. And they just keep telling you this over and over without ever showing you Kokomi making smart decisions, let alone be this big brain genius on screen. I've looked back into past quests and events, and the only moment to me that was a genuine smart move by Kokomi is when she brought backup to the front lines when confronting Potatozshara. It lifted morale, she got the element of surprise, got the Tenryo commission to retreat, and it was overall again a good introduction for Kokomi. But that was it. As we've established, she doesn't do much after her initial introduction. Most of the Archon quest after that is focused on Teppei, or at least the attempt on making the players care about Teppei. Kokomi makes the traveler captain for no real reason after a bunch of time skips, and I still hate the fact that they did this, by the way, because to the players it's only been 15 minutes, so it makes the whole thing even more ridiculous, and then she messes up the whole thing with the Fatui, and then that's it. The game doesn't show anything else in regards to her being a genius, both in the main quest and her story quest. Don't get me wrong, Kokomi does make good observations, but that doesn't really change anything. She still hasn't lived up to her title. She thinks of everything, Paimon might say, and she does. She has this whole book of directions that she gives to her soldiers. But if anything, that just shows how well prepared Kokomi is, and again, it doesn't really add to her being a genius. It just shows how she micromanages her soldiers. She reads a ton of military strategy books. That's also something that doesn't really mean much other than she has a hobby and it does give her a unique advantage, but again, it doesn't necessarily mean she's a genius. And that is entirely on Hoyo's end, because her character is only as smart as the writers. And for some reason, the writers are so insistent on having a genius tactician, but unfortunately they don't seem to know how to execute that concept like at all. And Kokomi is the product of that. You could say that Yaemiko and Ayato are also two characters who suffer from this telling and not showing problem, and you would be kinda right. Yaemiko and Ayato to an extent is the everything is going to Keikaku trope, and they do have a lot of problems with their writing, Ayato especially, but Ayato and Yaemiko, to their credit, actually did something in the quest. Well, Yaemiko did. Yaemiko saved the traveler from Scaramouche, she trained the traveler before their confrontation with A, she's present in the final confrontation. It's almost like Yaemiko, A's oldest known friend, was crucial when trying to reason with her about the Vision Hunt decree. Who would have thought? And Ayato, while he stays true to character and does things in the background, gets his moment, if you can even call it that, by sending the resistance as backup to Tenchukaku. Which, in hindsight, is obvious that it was a retcon by Hoyo because I guess they forgot to give Ayato something to do in the Archon quest, or even just a good reason as to why he's absent the entire time despite being someone so important politically. Like, there was a civil war, where was this man? Was there a reason why Ayato was missing the entire time? I genuinely don't remember, but anyway, back to the point I'm trying to make. Like, Ayato, as terribly written as he might be, actually fits his role as this schemer in the background, at least. We see some of his scheming in his NPC story quest and also in some of the events where he and Yae Miko are usually scheming in the background, like during the Irodori festival. And speaking of events, why doesn't Hoyo fix Kokomi in events? Listen, I have complained a number of times about how time-gated lore events are literally ruining the story for new players especially, but I do consider them canon. Like, why wouldn't you consider them canon? Because most of the interesting bits of the lore and story are revealed in events. Which is why it sucks that not everyone can play through them. Like, characters like Albedo would have been forgotten by now if not for the lore-heavy events centered around him. It's events like Shadows Amidst Snowstorms or that Xiao Chasm quest I can't pronounce that can add a lot to an otherwise boring character. Taking Albedo as an example, his story quest is boring and forgettable. I'm not joking when I say I legit thought that the first Dragon Spine event was his story quest, because his story quest was so boring in comparison. Same with Xiao. I mean, his story quest was slightly better than Albedo's, but his development mostly happened through the multiple Lantern Rite quest and most recently the Chasm. So why can't Kokomi receive the same treatment? See, Kokomi is kinda similar to Albedo in some ways. Like, they're both very lore relevant, like very lore relevant. I would say Kokomi is even more relevant, at least at this point in time, because she played, or should have played, a crucial role in the Inazuma Archon quest. While Albedo is super important with his Khaenri'ah roots, I don't think this will become relevant again until we reach Khaenri'ah or we bump into Dainsleif while we're with Albedo or something. But Kokomi, we had an entire patch related to Watatsumi's history, and Kanomiya was right there. It revealed so much about the history of Orobashi and Watatsumi Island in general, but somehow we never got anything about Kokomi being related to Enkanomiya. But maybe Hoyo is just saving the lore for later because for whatever reason they like the slow burn when it comes to character lore. But it's been 2 years, most of the player base forgot Enkanomiya even exists at this point, and Kokomi has had not 1, not 2, but 4 reruns. Fontaine is literally out, and somehow we've only gotten to see her in an event about Genius Invocation TCG and the obligatory Klee summer event. Nothing about her and her lore. Like, even Kazuha and Ito has had more events centered around them and their backstory, and Ito doesn't even have that much lore outside of being an Oni and the Arataki gang. But for some reason, Hoyo just refuses to give Kokomi the spotlight or anything to redeem her writing. They've tried making her look like the genius when playing Genius Invocation TCG because I guess being a good military tactician also means you're good at card games. Hoyo clearly messed up her writing in the Inazuma patch, and now they don't know what to do with her. And what frustrates me even more is that Hoyo does know most of the player base hated the execution of the Inazuma Archon quest because Sumeru was so well done in comparison. From the pacing to the central characters, the build-up, almost everything about Sumeru's quest was an improvement from Inazuma's. Including the smart characters, Nahida was done particularly well because Hoyo managed to sell her as being this wise character by making her guide the traveler to reach their own conclusions, instead of telling the players how wise Nahida is every 5 minutes. And they also did really well when writing Alhaitham as this ultra pragmatic guy who is too smart for his own good. Taking down the academia is almost as high stakes as taking on the shogunate. Granted, there isn't any god out to get us unless you want to count Scaramouche, but there was still high stakes villains involved, like again Scaramouche and Dottore. But Hoyo managed to write a believable plan in taking down the main villains using Alhaitham as as the mastermind of said plan. And it's believable when Al-Haytham is the one who pointed out how the academia has been predicting Sino's every move. It's believable because we've gotten the time to get to know him and his thought process. And there's a clear end goal to his plan: infiltrate the academia with the help of Nilo and the others, set Nahida free, and bada bing bada boom, villain defeated. Okay, obviously it's not that simple, but what I'm trying to say here that Al-Haytham had a clear goal from the start. He knew something was suspicious, he investigated, he came up with a very detailed plan involving the right set of people, and the plan worked. And the Traveler was involved from start to finish. It's what made the Sumeru Archon quest feel so well written, because we got to see every aspect of the plan and its execution, and there's no weird time skips. And all of the things that Al-Haytham did in the Sumeru Archon quest are things that Kokomi should have done and shown in the Inazuma Archon quest, but unfortunately didn't. Instead, she wins against Yaimiko in a card game for no real reason other than that's Kokomi for ya. And it genuinely makes me sad to say that it leaves Kokomi as this missed potential of a character. There's literally so much to her backstory and lore and even personality that Hoyo failed to show over and over again. I will now list down a few theories and fan interpretation that I personally find interesting. So yeah, let's start with the most popular theory on Kokomi, and that is Kokomi being the reincarnation of the Hydro Dragon, or one of the 7 sovereigns. So if you're rusty on Enkanomiya lore like I am, here's a very brief recap without getting too much into the theory and Enkanomiya lore. The 7 sovereigns are the 7 primitive elemental dragons that used to rule over Tivat before the primordial one. And for a long time, people speculated that Kokomi was the reincarnation of the Hydro Dragon because her constellation means sleeping dragon. And also there's that whole lore about how the Hydro Dragon will be reborn as a human. So there's a lot of discussion on this and how Hoyo might expand Kokomi's story based on this theory. And I just remember seeing so many speculations about how this might be the plot of Kokomi's second story quest, or how she will finally be tied to Enkanomiya. But yeah, since Fontaine is out, I'm pretty confident that the Hydro Dragon is not really related to Kokomi. But I might be wrong, but nah. But I'm including it here because people speculated this about Kokomi for a long time. Another fun one is that some Kokomi fans feel like she would have been a more well-rounded character had she been a bit more morally ambiguous. It certainly will explain why she accepted the mystery supporter in the Archon quest. She would have been great as someone who struggles with morality and having to live with the burden of sacrificing people for the greater good. The end justifying the means kind of character. She doesn't have to be evil or cunning, just someone who is forced to make a lot of tough decisions because she's been appointed as the leader of an entire island against her will, or simply because she's a descendant of a very important bloodline. And because she's this military strategy nerd, she also gets a bunch of beginner's luck and wins a bunch of battles, but now she's been put in this impossible situation of having to lead her people against an invincible god. And not just any god, it's the same god who killed the savior of her people, killer of the god whose will lives through Kokomi herself. Anything would have been more interesting than what we got, but I guess Hoyo's given up on Kokomi, at least story-wise. So yeah, that is my very long rant of Kokomi. I actually really like her design and I love using her in team comps, which is why I'm annoyed that she has so much potential and she is so interesting lore-wise, and Hoyo just does nothing with her. Hopefully they will revisit Kokomi sometime in the future and let her have her moment. Please just give this girl a break. I hope you enjoyed the video, and sorry this took longer to make because mental health and life, but thank you so much for 2,000 subscribers. That's so many of you. I'm so floored by the response. It's been amazing and I really love hearing what all of you have to say. Please remember that all of the things I'm saying in my videos are my opinion and you are absolutely allowed to agree or disagree with them. I love reading your thoughts. So yeah, subscribe if you want. If not, that's fine too, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.